So first of all, let me introduce our guest, Dr. Conie Olовсон. Mr. Olовson is a senior economist at the Sveriges Riksbank, and he received his PhD from Stockholm University. He also worked as a visiting researcher at the Institute for International Economic Studies. Dr. Olовson has considerable teaching experience, almost 20 years in the field of quantitative methods in macroeconomics and mathematics. Today, Dr. Olовson will speak on international business cycles. This is a joint project with Johan Gars, who represents Royal Swedish Academy of Science. So you're welcome, and the floor is yours. Please.
Thank you very much for the invitation. I'm very happy to be here. So this is the paper I will talk about. It's called International Business Cycles, Quantifying the Effects of a World Market for Oil. So I work as I should just say a few words about the background. I work as a researcher at Sveriges Riksbank, as was just said. And so we do research there, as some of you might know, like 80%, and 20% is supposed to be policy support to the Riksbank. And then I was assigned to do policy work in setting up a new version of the DSG model that they build there. And the idea is to build a model that has some influence, a larger influence from foreign shocks, so to speak, because Sweden is, as you know, a small open economy, so the outside world matters a lot. So we would try to incorporate that into the model, and that is generally not easy, as I will talk about in this project. So I have been involved in working on that, in that policy task, and I also carried out some academic research in this field. All right, so when it comes to international real business cycles, there are several problems, or puzzles as we call them, in the sense that the models that we set up generally they typically have a hard time accounting for several features of the data. And this has been known at least since the early 90s, when a few papers by Bacchus, Kehoe, and Schydland came out and showed this. So there are several features. And when I say puzzles, I mean, that means basically that the models do not replicate the data, and many people have tried to solve these so-called puzzles, but these puzzles are still there, so it's not an easy task to do that. And the first thing is that if you look at just cross-country correlations of output, so GDP in one country, how it correlates with another country, then you will find that that correlation coefficient tend to be high and positive and high. And in particular, these correlations are higher than the cross-country correlations for consumption. So this is what the data looks like. But the problem is that almost all models that you set up, they will have the opposite feature. They will tell you that the cross-country correlations for consumption will be high, and that for output will actually be low. I'm sorry, I should also say that I don't know that I'm happy to take questions at any point in time. If there's something I say that you don't understand or agree with, just interrupt me and ask me. So, yeah, okay. That's one part of the puzzle, that these cross-country correlations for output are high in the data, and higher in particular than the cross-country correlations for consumption. But the models will predict the opposite. And this is called the consumption correlation puzzle, or the quantity anomaly. And another puzzle is the fact that also employment, or labor supply if you want, and investments are also positively correlated across countries. But a typical model will again say the opposite, that those should be negatively correlated. And of course, this is important if we want to build a model, say at Sveriges Riksbank, that you're going to use and where the foreign economy matters a lot, then you're going to run into these problems. The model will have several counterfactual predictions. This second puzzle is typically referred to as the international co-movement puzzle. Okay, so the reason for the first puzzle is easy to understand, basically, because in these models you have two economies, and through financial markets, households can insure against country-specific risk. So they can diversify away that risk. That immediately will tell you that consumption will move together in these two countries. They insure each other. So if there's a bad shock in one country, the other country, through the financial market, they can take positions so that consumption will then move together. And this is, as I said, this is a puzzle, meaning that it's not easy to get around this. People have looked at different ways to do that. So you could say you could introduce trading frictions, and you can restrict asset trading. But it doesn't really help. So even if there are two countries and they just have one financial asset, then you will get this puzzle back into the model typically. So you have to say that, no, there are no financial markets. They cannot insure at all. If you do that so that these countries are in financial autarky, then the model would start to replicate the data better. But we think that's a bad description of the real world. And the reason for the other puzzle is the fact that employment and investment are positively correlated. I will talk more about the intuition behind these effects, but the intuition is basically that if there is some bad technology shock in one country, then efficiency actually requires that the resources are reduced in that country and increased in the other country. That's an efficient condition, actually. And that immediately implies this low cross-country correlation of inputs and outputs. When it comes to international economics and international business cycles, there are more puzzles than this. I mentioned these two puzzles, and I'm going to talk about them and try to address them in this presentation, but there are other puzzles related also to this literature. So what we are going to do in this paper is try to quantify the contribution of exogenous changing originating in the oil market to the international business cycle. And then we're going to relate them to the role of exogenous changes originating outside of the oil market. So we want to see if oil can be a contributor to positively correlated business cycles. And you would think, then you would say, why would oil matter for anything? Well, the thing is that oil is, in macroeconomics, we typically focus on capital and labor. Those are the inputs that we tend to focus on. And the reason for that is that they are the largest production factors. There are other production factors, and energy and oil are important, but, energy's share of income, so to speak, energy's share of GDP is very small. It's like 3 to 5% on average. So you would think that energy and oil cannot be important because the share is so small. The payments that go to labor as a share of GDP, that's almost 70%. And the payments that go to energy is like 3 to 5%. So that's the reason, I think, why people don't focus on oil and energy. But oil and energy is an essential input into the production function. We all know that. And the reason for why oil could matter is that it's an input that is sold on a world market. Okay? So all countries will be affected by changes in this input. So if there is a shock to the oil supply, if there all of a sudden is much more oil available, that will affect all countries basically the same, and they will all basically face the same oil price changes. So you have some component there which is at least common to all countries. Another thing is that in the production process, there is complementarity between energy and capital and labor. Like, if you have a car, that's capital. But in order to run the car, you need some oil or energy. Otherwise, you will not be able to drive the car. So that means that you need both capital and labor and oil. They're complementary. You cannot run the car without the oil, with just the capital, or with just the oil. You need both. And that's important because then shocks to the oil supplies, say, implies that if all of a sudden you have much more oil, if all countries have more oil, then, you know, in order to put that into production, you also need to work more. You need, so the point is that shocks to the oil supply will actually affect labor supply and investments in capital. So that's the idea we want to see if it makes sense. But again, oil's share of income is very small, so we don't know if this could matter for anything. I like to give a preview of the results early on so that you know where I'm going. And what we find in this paper is that the model with oil actually can resolve both these puzzles. So the model with oil will feature positive cross-country correlations of output, labor supply, and investments. And also the other puzzle that I talked about, the consumption correlation puzzle, saying that typically the cross-country correlation for output is higher than that for consumption. But models predict the opposite, but here we find that that is actually true in this model with oil. I also said that there is a large literature that has been studying these puzzles since the early 90s. And there are not many papers that have been able to come up with ideas for how to reduce these puzzles. There are 3 papers that I know of, and I mentioned them here. I don't really want to talk about them so much. The first paper by Corsetti, De Dola, and Leduc, they don't focus on these 2 puzzles. They focus on something completely different. But they argue, they mention that, in fact, their model actually seems to resolve these 2 puzzles. And in their paper, it seems to be that productivity shocks are very highly correlated across countries. So if countries have technology shocks that are highly correlated, then of course, you know, output, employment, investment will co-move. So if say they get the same shocks all the time, you know, you get a high technology shock, positive, in one country and also in the other country, and the next period you get a negative one in both countries, etc. Then, of course, things will co-move. So that's part of the puzzle, that if you actually estimate these shocks and try to estimate them from data, you will find that they are not highly correlated. But in their calibration or in their estimation, that seems to be the case. And there are 2 other papers there. I'm not going to talk about them, but I will just mention them. Anyway, our paper then is the first to show that these puzzles can be solved by including oil. So so what I'm going to do is I'm going to set up a model, and I'm going to include oil, as I said, and then I'm going to see if that can resolve these puzzles, and I have an idea why that could be the case, and I mentioned that oil is essential and all countries are affected by shocks to the oil, and oil is like, it's also complementary to capital and labor. That's the idea. But before I do that, I will just show you some data so you can see what I'm talking about. So I'm going to use some data, and this is just publicly available data from OECD, the Federal Reserve Bank of St. Louis, and the US Energy Information Administration. And the time period I look at is from 96 to 2016, and this was because this was the data we could find on this that was publicly available. Yeah, so this is what it looks like, if you can see. So here are international movements. So what we see here is contemporaneous cross-country correlations with the same US variables. So this is Australia, and Y is GDP. So this shows, this first entry shows the correlation of Australian GDP with US GDP. And this is the correlation of Swedish GDP with US GDP. So all these correlations are with the US. And of course you don't need to do that, but that's often what people look at. But you could of course look at all correlations possible between these countries. And people have done that. It changes slightly, but you get still a similar message here. So what you see here is that this is GDP then. So what I said was like, you can see that these correlations, they're all positive. And some of them are pretty large. So United Kingdom 0.81, Sweden 0.78, and so forth. That means that output moves, it's positively correlated, it moves. If it's high in the US, it's high in Sweden, etc. The next column shows consumption, the cross-country correlation for consumption. Okay, so, and then I said that the puzzle is that the correlation for output tends to be higher than that for consumption. And that's not true for the first entry, but if you look at these entries, you will find that for all the first entries, that's true. And the average is clearly below that for output. So this correlation coefficient is lower than that. This is the data. Model is actually similar. You can't hear me? Should I speak louder? Yes. Okay. All right. Yeah. So this is not working, I guess, now. Or maybe I turned it off. No? Yeah, I don't know. Okay, but do I need to sit down then? Okay, so we're gonna set up a model, and it's going to be similar to a model by Bacchus and Cricini from 2000. Okay. Yeah, if you can't hear me, you have to let me know. I'll try to speak loud. Yeah, so I guess most people are not familiar with this model by Bacchus and Cricini, but if you would be in the literature, you would know what it is, so that's why I mentioned it. We're going to look at factor-specific shocks. They look at what is called Higgs-neutral shocks. So a Higgs-neutral shock is a technology shock that affects all the inputs in the same way. It would affect capital and labor in the similar way. But if you have factor-specific shocks, you can get a shock to the labor productivity, say, and to the energy efficiency. So we will have differences here. I will be more specific in a while. We're going to try to make this. There are going to be oil shocks in this model. And what is an oil shock? Well, typically when people talked about oil shocks before, they meant like a shock, like the price increased a lot or something like that. The oil shocks of the 70s, that was what was happening then. But here they're going to be shocks to the oil supply. So we want to think of the oil price as being endogenous in this model. It's explained by the model. So there will be shocks to the oil supply, and we will try to make these shocks consistent with an empirical measure of exogenous oil shocks that is being constructed by Killian. And we're also going to, so in this paper by Bacchus and Cricini, they assume complete markets. And as I said, that will tend to make consumption to be highly correlated. We're going to drop that assumption. So these are main differences. Now I'm going to talk about the model. Okay, so there will be 3 countries. And the reason is we want 2 countries, right? Because we want to have like a domestic economy and some outside world. And this is not going to be based on Sweden. But anyway, so there are 2 countries first, country H and country F, so home and foreign. And then there's a 3rd country, and the 3rd country is selling the oil. So it will have the index E. So there are 2 countries, country H and country F, and then there's an oil country that sells oil. Okay, and then, so the production process in two will be that use capital and labor. Here we also say that you use capital, labor, and oil to produce this intermediate good. And they're going to buy then this oil from country E, and they will pay with these intermediate goods. That's the structure. They produce intermediate goods, they trade these intermediate goods with each other, and they also buy oil from country E, and they pay with these intermediate goods. And neither capital or labor is assumed to be international mobile. Okay, here's an equation. This is the intermediate good, X, and it has subscript I, and I stands for H and F, so there are 2 countries. They have the same production technology for producing this intermediate good. And this object here, that is typically what the production function will look like in 99% of macroeconomic literature. So that's what I said. You have a solo type shock here, and then you have capital and labor in a Cobb-Douglas nesting. That's a standard assumption. What we do now is to say that, well, you need to use capital and labor, but you also need to use oil to produce. And then this epsilon thing here is then the elasticity of substitution between capital labor and oil. So it tells you how substitutable these objects are. And as I said, like, we're going to set this epsilon to be a low number, and that's based on other research that I have, where we estimate this epsilon. And we find it to be basically zero. And that's if you think of it, it makes sense, because as I said with the car, you know, you have the car, but you need a certain amount of energy to drive that car. You can't change that in the short run. If you want to change that, you need to sell your car and buy another car, which is more energy efficient. That's the way this goes about. So in the short run, you have a machine, you have a computer that requires a certain amount of energy. That cannot be changed. You cannot adjust that. That's what it means to have a low epsilon. You need them both. Yes?
A simple question. So the productivity shock of oil is also country specific. Yeah, so it's different in different countries.
No, you're right. So I haven't talked about the shocks. I will do that now, but it has an index there, country-specific index. So let me comment on that. So you just wanted to say that we're going to set this epsilon to be low, and it makes sense, I would argue. But we have also another paper where we estimate it, and other people have estimated, and it almost always comes out close to zero. Now, there are two, as I said, A and B are shocks here, or strictly these sets are shocks, but this A and B, they are shocks. So, and they are factor specific. That means that this A will affect the capital labor efficiency, and the B will affect the energy efficiency. So in the other paper, we measure these A and B over time. You can see what they look like. And it's like the A thing, that's like a TFP thing, basically. It looks like a solo type shock. So over time, it would grow. And the B, it captures energy efficiency. So that means that it will also grow over time. And as I said, we measure this in another paper, and you can see how it responds to different things. But here it's a stationary model, so here we don't focus on these trends over time. We focus on like the deviations from trends, so these are shocks. So you can think of this like the energy efficiency is growing over time, meaning that, you know, your car, either you can run it over time on less gasoline, or what has happened in practice, I guess, is that the cars have also become much more heavy, so they still require a certain amount of energy, but, you know, relative to the weight, that's an improvement anyway. So it increases over time. But that process is not smooth, so you can view that as shocks to the oil efficiency in each country here, in country H and country F. So there are two shocks going on, one hitting the capital labor efficiency and one hitting the oil efficiency. I will talk more about these shocks. For now, it is enough to say that this A shock is standard. It's what Solo basically showed how to measure. And people have done, you know, written millions of papers on that, like Solo type shocks. Yes?
What is the difference in measuring productivity of capital as productivity of oil?
I mean, yeah, so if you have a structure like this, there are ways to, I will actually show you later exactly how we do it, but you can get equations that tells you exactly how to measure A and how to measure B. So Solo, what he did, he had he did it for a general function, and he said, like, with a minimum number of assumption, you can actually measure this A, right? But here you have two shocks. So you're going to get two equations with that one that tells you, you know, what you need to measure A, and one that tells you that.
I just don't understand how you divide the productivity of capital. It's like Y divided by K, but in oil it is like inside the index, what we do you divide these two?
Okay, so I mean, maybe we can, when I calibrate them all, I will derive these equations, and maybe we can get back to it then. Because I don't have the slides prepared for that, but I will get to that in a while. So now, that's not super important. What is important is that I'm telling you that there are shocks to the oil efficiency, and there are ways you can measure them, right? I will show you later what equations we use and what information you use. But I'm presenting now just a model, and where the shocks enter, and we can get back to that. Okay, so as I said, Solo showed how to measure this A component, and the typical assumption is that it follows some autoregressive process. It's highly autocorrelated, and we're going to do a similar thing. Now, these are just intermediate goods, this X here. So later, in these countries, you need to combine these intermediate goods. You need to use the goods that are produced in your country, the intermediate goods, and the goods that are produced in the foreign country. And you combine them in some way to produce final output, Yj. So again, this sigma is now the elasticity of substitution between these objects, how substitutable they are. There's a large literature on this sigma, and I'm not going to address that right now, maybe later in the calibration. But this eta j will then determine home bias. If this is a large number, you will put a high weight on intermediate goods from your own country, and a low weight then on intermediate goods from the foreign country. So there will be households in this model, and they will just have, these are standard preferences. They derive utility for consumption, and 1 minus L is leisure. So consumption and leisure in some Cobb-Douglas nesting, and this is the risk aversion coefficient, is 5. So nothing fancy about this production utility function. Okay. So then there is a technical budget constraint. Looks messy, but it just says that what you consume plus what you save in capital, and S is bond holdings. So there is a bond that these countries can trade in. So you can save in capital in each country and in a bond. So you consume something, you save some capital, you hold some bonds, and you have some income. And the income comes from capital, you hold some capital, and from working, from labor income, and from the bonds you held from the previous period. And then there are two ugly objects here. The first one is this. And this is not interesting at all. It's just that in this type of model, if you don't include something like this, bond holdings will not be stationary. So they will not be centered around 0, which you want in steady state. So you need this psi s needs to be some small number. I didn't really want to include this, but last time I didn't, and somebody complained and said bond holdings are not stationary, so I included it now, but I think it's just a technical detail. This psi s will be something very close to 0. If it's just very close to 0, bond holdings are stationary. Otherwise, not. So you need this thing. It's not quantitatively important. And then there's this thing here is capital adjustment cost. So that's also standard in these models, that you assume that you cannot just adjust capital without a cost. You will actually, it costs you something to make these adjustments. And there will be a function like that. Now we'll go to oil production. So now we know about country H and country F. They produce these intermediate goods. They combine them into final goods. And households, maximize utility. So now we go to oil production. So this oil country, we assume it's a competitive country. It's not a monopoly or anything. And it sells oil to country H and F. And we're going to assume that there is an exogenous part to the oil supply and an endogenous part. So this is oil supply. Here's something that moves around exogenously. And this is an endogenous part. So you can see that with capital, they can adjust how much oil to produce. And these objects here are just constants. Now, the reason for having the exogenous part, this is thought of as OPEC's oil supply. And the endogenous part is then thought of as non-OPEC supply. And the reason is that exogenous shocks to the oil supply, in particular the OPEC supply, has occurred relatively frequently throughout history. So, you know, there are wars, there are revolutions, there are other exogenous political events that affect the oil supply. They occur regularly and they can be substantial. And this has been documented by both Hamilton and Killian, two authorities on this in this field. So this is where our so-called oil shocks enter. There's a war somewhere and that affects the oil supply, the exogenous part of the oil supply. Now this is the exogenous part, and again this is a shock then. This set moves around, it goes up, it goes down. We're going to make it consistent with this measure that I talked about in the beginning. Killian has constructed a measure. I will just talk more about that later when I calibrate the model, where he tries to go through, you know, from 1970 up to 2004 and take each of these incidents and try to characterize the changes in oil supply that can be considered exogenous. So the maximization problem in the oil country looks like this. It's not complicated. This part in square bracket, this first part is the exogenous oil supply, and this is the endogenous oil supply. So this is all the oil they sell, and this is the price of oil denoted in their own currency. And they have some cost for producing this oil. They use capital and they rent it from the households. Okay, as I said, markets are incomplete. There is, in each country you can save in capital, and there is a bond that these countries can hold. So, but it's in zero net supply. So if one country holds a positive amount of this bond, the other country must hold a negative position in that bond. And we're not going to allow the oil producers to hold this bond. And the reason for that is that the oil shocks that we consider, they are, as I write it, they are associated with wars, political turmoils, revolutions, etc. And in those states, you know, the bond will not insure you against those events. In fact, in a majority of the episodes on this index that I talked about, that Killian bases his index on, the US, which will be country H in our model, was either directly at war with the oil producers or froze their assets. So I have some examples here. In 1979, the US froze $11 billion of Iran's assets after the Iranian Revolution. And in the 1990, President Bush froze $30 billion from Iraq during the Gulf War. And in 2003, they invaded Iraq and brought down Saddam Hussein. So, you know, these are the events we're talking about, and we do not allow country E to insure against this with a bond. And this seems to be realistic. There's a report by IMF showing that these countries do not typically share risks in this sense. So they are heavily dependent on oil. So falling oil prices will imply reduced economic activity, fiscal revenues, and fiscal spending, for instance. So this is a feature we build into the model. All right, so now I have described the model. So we have these three countries, and as I said, it's not complicated, but because there are 3 countries, it becomes a bit messy. And so the equilibrium, I just write down in words what it looks like. But as you can see, there are 32 quantities, so there are 45 equations and 45 unknowns. So if you have one country, the model is small, but you know, as you have more countries, the model really blows up. So the competitive, it's still very intuitive. So you only need profit maximization in country H and F for these intermediate producing firms. They maximize profits. And you also have, similar for the firms that produce final goods, you need profit maximization. And in country H and F, households maximize utility. All markets must clear. There are no trading frictions, so the law of one price must hold, and that just means that the relative price of these intermediates must be the same in all countries. And there are some resource constraints, and they need to be respected. So this is just in words what it means. And so nothing strange. Now we're going to try to calibrate this model. So we will identify country H as the United States. And we will have country F as the rest of the world. So the US, you know, for country H seems like a logical choice because the US is by far the world's largest consumer of oil. It accounted for almost 30% of world consumption between 1980 and 2000. And for the rest of the world, so the US, they don't have, there's not much bilateral trade with any specific country, right? So you could take Canada, but even with Canada, it's not that big. So instead, we construct a rest of the world from all these countries. So it's Austria, Belgium, Denmark, Finland, France, Germany, Greece. Yeah, it's the same countries as we had on the first table, I guess. And why these countries? Well, these are the countries we could find the data for that we needed. And they are the same as in other papers. I only mentioned one there, but other papers have done the same thing. They also construct the rest of the world in country. But we take out Canada and Norway because we want country H and country F to be net oil importers. So the US, they produce oil themselves, but you know they're still a net importer. And all these countries are also net importers of oil. And that, in order to make the model consistent with the real world, this is what we do. All right, so now I'm going to assign some values to these production functions. So the first one, again, this is the intermediate good, and I said it's produced with capital, labor, and oil. And there are a few parameters here. It's alpha and the epsilon. And the epsilon, I said, is like this, the elasticity of substitution between these oils. And I said it's low. So we set it to 0.09. It's close to 0, meaning that you need both to produce. And it says HKO here. This is Hassler, Crusell, and Olofson. This is other research that I have where we estimate this thing. And it is close to 0, we find that. Then this alpha, it's a standard parameter in the macroeconomic literature. It determines basically capital's share of output. So it has a standard value around 0.3, and that's what we assign to in this model. Okay, this sigma is the elasticity of substitution between intermediate goods from country H and country F. And we steal this value from the paper I just referred to, Heathcote and Parry. They have a value saying it's 0.9. But I think in general, in the empirical literature, this value can can go from quite low to quite high. People have found different estimates, but depending on, yeah, you would distinguish between micro and macro estimates. So we're going to vary it later in a sensitivity analysis. But it's set to 0.9 in the benchmark. And then these objects, eta H and eta F, they determine, as I said, home bias. So we set them to match eta H is set to 0.9. That produces that exports as a share of GDP is 12% for the US, and for the rest of the world it's 8%. So that's the way we pin down these production parameters. And then you have a utility function, and there are some parameters here. So you have a discount factor, it doesn't show up here, but the discount factor is a standard value, how you discount future utilities. Set it to 0.99, which is like always what people do in quarterly models. And this mu thing here is set so that households work, they spend a third of their time working. This phi, is it called, right? It's set to 2, it captures risk aversion. And again, we don't have a good choice for that. We follow the literature on the international business cycle, they typically assign a value of 2. And then there are a bunch of other things here. So this is the population size. So it matters in this type of model. So the size of the population in country H, which is the US, is normalized to 1. And then we set the population in the rest of the world so that US GDP is 1/3 of the world GDP. And then you have productivity. Again, it's normalized to 1 in the US. And you can measure productivity in the rest of the world, and you will find that it's about 80% of that in the US. So then these parameters you don't remember, but they relate to the oil supply. So what we want to match here is that energy share of income, the payments that goes to energy, is around 5% of GDP. Which is something it's easy to measure. It's true in the data. And that's what I said in the beginning, that energy share of income, the payments that go to energy as a share of GDP, are very small. They're around 3 to 5%. And we also want that OPEC's share of the total oil supply is actually less than 50%. And these 3 last parameters, they determine a capital adjustment cost, and we set them to match the standard deviation for investment, basically. Yeah, so there are a few parameters that one need to assign values to, but nothing particularly strange. And now we can come back to the question about how you measure A and B. So what we show in this other paper, that I refer to as HKO, there we show that you can measure this A from this equation. And this basically follows what Solo did. You assume that firms are competitive, and then you will actually get an equation like this. Quite straightforward, just from profit maximization. So what you need to measure A is GDP. Measure of the expression for B, you need GDP, oil use, and oil share of income. And this again, it follows straightforward from. Now, this is from another graph, so it's from another paper, so it's a bit messy. I didn't have time to produce a new one, but this blue line here that you can see, that is actually a measure of B, the energy efficiency, how it evolves over time. So it says that you can see that it's growing quite a lot over time. That means that you can produce, with less energy over time. So here you need a certain amount of energy to produce. Over here, you need basically half the amount of energy to produce the same amount. And it's interesting, I don't have time to talk about it, but you can see it's kind of flat up till 1973. then it starts growing like a lot here. And that's because, you know, the first oil shock hit in 1973. So what that tells you is that before that, people didn't really develop, you know, any more energy efficient capital. But once these oil shocks hit, then that became an issue. So energy efficiency started to grow faster. That seems to be like an endogenous response to these shocks. And this top black dotted line is then a measure of the A, how A evolves over time. So in order to measure these shocks, A and B, in our setting, so here I have 4 periods, which is, you can see period 1 to 4, which is confusing. So in the paper, I think we only have data from here to here, from 96 or something like that. So there we will just take, but this is still illustrated. You can take a straight line through the data, and you deduct that, and then the shocks will then be, you know, the residuals, the deviations from this trend, and you can compute the properties for these shocks, how they behave, and then you can feed that back into the model. So if you do that, you get the following estimates. So A, we require these matrices to be symmetric. So this is the A shock in country H, and this is the A shock in country F. So 0.98, that just means that it's highly autocorrelated. You know, it will be the same value basically next period. And this 0.013 captures spillover. So some of the shock immediately spills over to the other country. And you get something similar for the B shock here. So it's also highly autocorrelated, but less than the A shock. And there are more spillovers. And you can measure the standard deviations of this shock. The B shock is more volatile than the A shock. And finally, the A shocks are correlated across countries. The cross-country correlation is 0.21. That means just that, you know, there's some positive correlation, that you get positive shocks in both countries and negative shocks and so on. The B shock has a higher correlation. So that's how we measure these shocks, okay? We're going to feed them into the model. And then we also need a measure of, so there are the A shocks, the B shocks, and then there are shocks to the exogenous oil supply. So we need to impose that as well. And then, as I said already, Kilian provides a monthly index, a monthly measure of exogenous shocks to the oil supply. He looks at the period from 1971 to 2004, and he includes both positive and negative shocks. So he goes through, you know, from this, over this period, he looked at each event, saying like the Iranian Revolution, he said classify it as exogenous. You need to take a stand on whether it's exogenous or endogenous shock. I guess that, you know, like if you take the oil embargo in 1973, you can't really say that that's an exogenous shock, because the incentive to form a cartel depends on demand, for instance. So it's not exogenous. So you need to take a stand on what is exogenous, what is endogenous. So he argues that some of these events are exogenous, and then he computes exactly how much oil supply was affected by that shock. And that's, again, something we feed into this model. We take this measure and feed it into the... So how am I doing on time? How much? This I have discussed. Yeah. Okay, so here we have data and the model. And we have 4 panels here. So the first one is the one we're really interested in. These are international correlations. So the data, it now looks a bit different than what I showed you before, because before I showed you individual countries. Here they have been aggregated into one big country. Okay, and that changed the numbers somewhat. So in fact, this coefficient now is slightly higher than this one. And I said before that the puzzle was that this is actually lower than this one. And that's kind of true, but I guess the true puzzle is that the model would predict that the correlation coefficient for consumption would be 0.9 or something like that, and output would be around 0. But I think if you look at the studies more carefully, what they say is that they can actually be kind of the same magnitude, but it shouldn't be much bigger anyway. Okay, so this is the data, and the data says that the correlation with the US and the rest of the world as we constructed it is 0.77, and the model predicts 0.75. And then our measure of consumption, it's much lower correlated, it's 0.45. According to the data we have, it should be 0.78. But you can see also for labor supply and investments, both the data and the model are now highly correlated. Also oil use is positively correlated. So in that sense, that's a successful model, because I said this is kind of hard to do. You don't get this from most models. And we did another experiment. This gamma, we said it would be very, very low. What was the gamma? Well, the gamma was, I think it's here, I think. Yeah, so the gamma is, it's a weight on oil. So we drive that to 0 basically, just for comparison, to try to make oil less important. And if you do that, then you get exactly what a standard model would predict. It will say that output is, the correlation for output is 0.15, very low, close to 0, and for consumption it's 0.6, it's very much higher. Labor supply, investment, negative. Okay, so that shows you that if oil has some weight, if it's somewhat important, the model can solve these puzzles. But as oil, you take away oil, you get back the standard predictions of the model. I'm not going to talk so much. You can, panel B, C, and D are just more comparisons between the model and the data. So you can see that these are like the within country correlations between output and consumption. It's kind of close, 0.9, 89. So all of these are kind of okay, except the last one, which is output and exchange rate. You can look at first order output correlations, and you can look at volatilities within the countries. So this panel is maybe not perfect, because the model output is 1.39 and in the data it's 0.15, so it's slightly higher in the model than in the data, whereas consumption and labor supply are less volatile than in the data. And this is matched by assumption. So with this we claim that, yeah, the model can actually solve these two puzzles. Even though it's not perfect in all dimensions, it still solves the puzzles. And one way to understand what's going on is to look at impulse response functions. So recall that there are 3 types of shocks in the model. And the first one here, so this is country H and this is country F in all these things, in all this. And this is the shock to the oil supply, this is the shock to capital labor, and this is the oil shock, sorry, the B shock. So the first one shows what happens when you get a shock to the oil supply. So as I said in the beginning, more oil affects all countries in the same way. So it benefits all countries, so they look very symmetrical. Everything basically increases. But the key thing here is that an oil shock in this set, an oil supply shock, has a low wealth effect, as we say. That means that you cannot eat the oil. I mean, if I give you a lot of oil, you cannot get utility from that directly by eating it. So instead, in this model, you need to put it into production to produce something. Okay, so you need to combine it with labor or capital. That means that if you get a supplier shock, an oil supply shock, what will happen is that people will, this purple line is investment. Then people will invest a lot in capital because, you know, this shock is highly resistant. So if you have more oil today, you will have more oil tomorrow. So you're going to invest more in capital. That means that investment responds a lot. And consumption does not respond so much. Instead, you save most of it for the future. So that takes care of the first part of the puzzle, because the blue line is output, and the red line, I don't know if you can see it, but it's below here. That means that output responds more than consumption. Consumption does not respond so much. And that was the puzzle, right? So it shows that output should respond more than consumption, basically. And that's what you can see here. And the reason is that people invest a lot. You know, they save, so they don't consume. And then we have this A shock. This is the, assume we get a positive shock to the capital, labor, technology in country H. Then you see that everything goes up. Everything is above zero. So investment goes up, oil use goes up, consumption goes up in that country. That's a standard boom in that country. But what happens in the other country? Well, as you can see, consumption goes up, but all the other objects here, production, investment, oil use, are actually, they go down. And this A shock is, you know, that's kind of the standard model. This is actually what it predicts. This is what you get from this shock. Things go in the wrong direction. And the reason for that is that this is the production function of this intermediate good. So if you get a positive shock in country H here to A, then they will work more. And again, since A is highly persistent, they will invest more. Now, there's complementarity between capital, labor, and oil. So they will also need to use more oil. They will buy more oil. That will drive up the oil price. So they will work more, they will use more inputs, and they will produce more. Okay, that's the standard rule. But what happens in country F then? Well, this, you can't see this from this graph, but what happens is that, you know, if you produce much more of this intermediate good XH, the intermediate good XF becomes relatively more scarce. And what happens then is that the relative price of that good increases. So the terms of trade changes. So that means that people in country H are now willing to pay more for the imports. It's a standard effect, because that intermediate good for country F is more scarce now. There are much more, you know, intermediate goods from H available. So that increases the price of intermediate good F. And that creates like a wealth effect in country F. So they now get more paid for their good. So they're better off. That benefits them. And what are they going to do? Well, they're going to consume more. And they will consume more, so consumption will go up in both countries. But they will consume more of all normal goods. So leisure is a normal good. So they will also go on vacation. They will work less because they are richer, and this wealth effect goes in that direction. They will consume more of leisure. That means that in country H, labor supply goes up, but in country F, labor supply goes down. So production also goes down in country F. That's the intuition for those things. So now we have two shocks, one that generates positive movement and one that generates negative movement. And there's a final shock here, and that's the B shock that affects the energy efficiency. And what you can see if you look at this for a while is that this green line is oil use. And you can see that thing is actually negatively correlated, but all the other lines, they react positively. Okay, so that also contributes to movement. So I don't know, it's not super complicated, but if country H get a positive shock to B, what will happen is that again, this is not something you can see here, but you can show that their oil use, OH, will actually go down. They will use less oil. But this thing will still increase. This is something you can show. So they use more oil in efficiency use, so to speak. And again, since there's complementarity between these two objects, they will also work more and invest more. So that's a shock to BH will increase hours, investments, and output. And in country F then, what happens is, I said oil use goes down in country H. So that means that oil price will fall and country F will buy more oil. They can buy more oil, so this thing will increase also in country F. And then they will also combine it with labor and capital to produce more. So to sum up this thing, the oil-related shocks, this is the shocks to the oil supply, and the shocks to the oil efficiency, they contribute to positive movements. And they, because of the wealth effect is small, output will respond more than consumption. And then there is a standard shock to capital labor efficiency, and that goes in the wrong direction. But it turns out that the net effect, as we saw on the table, is to make the model kind of reflects the data. You can look at the contribution of each shock to how they contribute to international movement. So you have the A shock, and then here we also have a Higgs neutral shock that I talked about. So this is what I said. Previously we had an A shock in here and a B shock in here. This A hat instead is placed outside, so it affects all the inputs in the same way. It doesn't. We just, for comparison, want to see what that means. And then you can see that the A shock and the Higgs neutral shock, they generate low or negative co-movement in output and high co-movement in consumption. Low in labor supply and low in investment. This is the standard hustle that I talked about before. This is what you get from these standard shocks, the shocks to capital labor efficiency. The oil-related shocks are B and C, and they generate almost perfect correlation of output, consumption, and so they contribute highly to that. So it's the combination of shocks that can generate what we want. It drives down, or rather up here, the correlation of output, and the correlation of consumption becomes lower. This is just A and B shocks, abstracting for the shocks to the oil supply. So these two shocks look pretty good altogether. The only thing is that oil use is then negatively correlated. So the oil supply shocks contribute to that. So, yeah, you need these energy efficiency shocks to replicate the data. That's the thing. And this is a variance decomposition where you show how much each shock contributes to the variance of each object here. So you have A, B in country H, A, F, so A, B in country F. So this is H, this is country F, and then you have shocks to the oil supply. And what this table shows is that if you look at consumption, these are the domestic shocks in country H, A and B. And then you can see it's 25 here, 25 here. So that's 50% of the variation in consumption in country F comes from domestic shocks. That means that 50% comes from abroad. And it's even more for output and labor supply. Now, in models, this is typically hard to get. So you don't get much impact from the foreign typically. But here you get a large international transmission mechanism, so to speak. In fact, I think it's too large. So these oil-related shocks in country F have a huge impact on all the variables in country H. Too large, I would say. It's not reasonable to think that this makes sense. Probably. But it's still interesting because it's so weakly standardized and it's very strong. This is just a sensitivity analysis, very parameter. I don't know how interesting it is. It's this sigma. I said it's the elasticity of substitution between home-produced goods and foreign-produced goods. So we vary that between 0.5 and 1.5. So kind of low number to a relatively large number. And you can see that the correlation coefficient for output stays above 0.6 always. There are two lines because we do this for, we have basically two versions of the model and I only shown one, but it's not the same. And this is for investment, it's the same, don't go below 0.7. This is for labor supply, don't go below 0.6. So even though we vary this elasticity of substitution, you know, it doesn't destroy the results. And this is the correlation coefficient for consumption minus that for output. And it should be negative, as I said, because output should be higher than consumption. And it remains negative also in the political. So what previous research have shown is that also in this model, we have that the A shocks, for instance, they are correlated across countries. I don't remember what the correlation coefficient was, but the correlation coefficient was maybe 0.2 or something like that, 0.25. There's a positive correlation. And previous papers have shown that if they are uncorrelated, it's kind of impossible to get positive commovement across countries. But that's not what we find. We find even if you have completely uncorrelated shocks, technology shocks across countries, you still get positive correlation of output and one that is higher than for consumption. High for labor supply, high for investment. So we get that also with fully uncorrelated shocks. Okay, and this is my this is the last graph I have before, or sorry, the last slide I have before summing up. So, yeah, I mean, this is a simple model. It has 3 countries, and you could question a number of assumptions, I guess. And one assumption you could question is like, yeah, so in this model, countries they're buying oil from an oil exporting country, but in the real world, for instance, the US, which is country H, they produce a lot of oil themselves. How would that matter for anything? Would that change the results in the model? And yeah, so a referee for the paper made this point, and I don't know the answer to that, but because I haven't checked. But I don't think it would have a very large effect because you know what? Exactly where the oil is coming from should not really matter for the determination of the price. So there will be some redistributional effect. The US would benefit more like they have oil, so there's a wealth effect going on there. But on the other hand, as I've already said, the revenues from oil is a very small fraction of US GDP anyway, so I don't expect that to have a big effect. There's another paper by Oldenstein, Greer, and Killian, and they show that the source of the origin of the oil production shock can matter for monetary policy. But we don't look at that, so I don't know. But yeah, I'm just saying that this is one issue that we have looked at and no, that we haven't looked at. These things might matter. All right, so to add, again, I have no idea how I'm going to answer. Is this too early?
I think it's 10 minutes.
Okay. All right, so what we did in this paper was to address these 2 puzzles that I talked about, the consumption correlation puzzle and the international correlation puzzle. So, and we look at a specific thing, we look at the role of oil. And we quantify the contribution of exogenous changes originating in the oil market to the international business cycle, and we related them to the role of changes outside of the role. And we found that the model can actually solve these two puzzles. And it will actually generate a movement even if shocks are completely uncorrelated across countries. So we conclude that the volume of oil can be quantitatively important for the business cycle, even though, again, energy share of output is very small. All right, so down. Presentation.
So any questions? Don't hesitate, please.
Okay, one question. Thank you very much for the presentation. It's pretty interesting, and we already talked with Connie about this, a little bit about this project, and you already said that this is kind of a part of work that you are doing for the model, the big model for the Riksbank, yes? So when you take this, what conclusions or what parts of this model will be you're going to represent in the new version of the Ramses? So I mean, like here you have the US and you have rest of the world, but then, and in this model, both countries, they can affect the oil market. So they can affect the supply of oil and the prices of oil. But for example, when you take Sweden, which is a small open economy and which has probably no effect on the oil market, how would these results or any conclusions, how they will change?
Yeah, exactly. That's a good question. So, as you said, I mean, here we don't have small open economies, really. They're big economies that actually affects things. And so, in the model we're building at the Riksbank, we need to think about Sweden as a small open economy, and then yeah, so that changes things. And so what we did, so the idea was there to get a larger influence from foreign shocks. And I guess we had several tracks that we followed. So one is without oil, and that one is with oil, to see if that would matter for anything. And so far, we just solved the model with oil, I think. So like late last week or something like that, they solved that for the first time. And estimated it, and you know, I don't think the results were a bit strange, but it was the first time they solved it and estimated it, so it was hard to say if it's useful or not at this point in time. So I don't have a good answer. You're right that things will be different, for sure. But whether it will make it or we will take it out, oil, or I don't know yet at this point. It's too early to say. They wanted oil also in the model for another reason, and that's because to measure CPI in different ways, with and without oil, for instance, with or without energy. Just to have a model that could, you know, do these things. So that interest is still there, I think. But again, I don't know the results yet, so I have to get back to you. Yeah.
Thank you very much for your presentation. And the question is about more long-run perspective of your model. Am I right that our oil dependence drives all these cross-country correlations in our world? So the question is the following. If you will go ahead and will be less oil dependent, is it true that our cross correlations will come back to this theoretical, not puzzling correlations which you showed in the introduction to the presentation? Thank you.
Okay, so did I understand correctly? You ask what happens if oil dependence goes down? Yeah. Yeah, I mean the model will predict then that you would. So First of all, I don't know, I mean, what would the data look like? I don't know. I mean, so the question is my model replicates the data somehow, but is it because it's a better model? I don't know. I mean, it might be just be, you know, so that's hard to judge. I mean, I don't know what the world would look like with less oil dependence. So, but the thing is, like, oil is one source of energy, and there are other sources of energy for sure, right? And but as you know, like, natural gas is highly correlated with natural gas is also traded internationally. So you could think of that. You know, you could think of my oil measures including gas, for instance. But if we would stop using fossil fuels and just use domestically produced energy instead, yeah, I mean, yeah, the model will for sure predict that you would like get a different type of correlations, but what would happen in the real world, I don't know. But I think the idea is that I focus on energy because I think it's important as an input, but you could imagine that there are other inputs maybe that are common also, and I don't know what they would be, but there are other commodities, for instance, maybe that are traded on the world market and needed as inputs in the production process.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Olofson, for showing the advantages of your model, for interesting results, and really valuable presentation. And thank you, everybody who came here today. I would like to remind you that in 2 weeks we will have a great scientific event, I mean our international conference, and please don't miss it. So thank you, thank everybody, and see you next time. So goodbye.